This is Professor Simon, and I'll be starting this new podcast on my YouTube channel entitled Current Events That Shape History. As a professor, I would like to give some insights into knowledge of what's going on in America right now and the world in general. Let me know what you think of this new podcast and its series. You can also subscribe below to keep up with my future videos. Before I get started, I did want to discuss that background image and logo that you always see in my YouTube channel. If you ever wondered about that image, it's actually a photograph from the Vietnam War, 1967. But those are actually not American soldiers. They're actually Australian soldiers that fought in the Vietnam conflict, and they're being picked up by U.S. Army. You can see those Huey helicopters, of course, picking them up. And about 60,000 Australian natives fought in the Vietnam War, supporting the United States in South Vietnam against the communists. And about 3,000 to 4,000 were killed or wounded. So I think that's considered one of the most famous images ever taken, maybe, of the Australians being involved in the war. But I thought it was kind of a cool image, and that's part of why I started using it for my YouTube channel years ago. So anyway, with my first podcast for this new series, I would like to delve into the 2024 presidential election that is upcoming in November. My big question about the 2024 presidential election, will this election be a repeat of what happened in 1968? Some historians have talked about that year before that election or written a great deal about it. So I'd like to talk about that a little bit with this first podcast. History sometimes repeats itself with historical events. I think pretty much everybody knows that about history. But if you go back to 1968, Presidential Lyndon Johnson, if you know about this, decided not to run for re-election, which he announced on March 31st, 1968, which shocked the nation, also shocked a lot of the media and newspapers, of course, that came out afterwards. This is very similar to President Joe Biden, who repeated the same scenario. Of course, July 21st, 2024, when he declined to run for re-election again against Republican nominee Donald Trump. This was supposedly due to his age, health concerns, and also maybe his unpopularity as well. There are many similarities between both the presidential election years of 1968 and 2024, which I'd like to talk about. Lyndon Johnson, similar to President Joe Biden, had become unpopular by 1968. One major issue, of course, was the ongoing conflict in Vietnam War, which, of course, you see that image behind me, which had consumed his administration and his other policies, like the war on poverty and all that. He also had numerous social unrests, throughout the country, mass protests and riots ongoing, college students protesting against the Vietnam War, because many of them were going to get drafted into the war. Also that year, you had a couple famous political assassinations that occurred. Martin Luther King Jr. Was killed in Memphis, Tennessee. Robert F. Kennedy was also assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan in June of 1968. So overall, there was this general discontent with the entire direction of the country. After Johnson declined to run for re-election, you had numerous Democratic candidates that emerged to replace him. You had Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota. There was Bobby Kennedy, RFK of New York, George McGovern of South Carolina, George Wallace of Alabama, and then you also had Hubert Humphrey of Minnesota, who was LBJ's vice president, who joined the race with the likely backing of Lyndon Johnson, just similar to Kamala Harris, with Joe Biden, of course, wanting to represent her for the presidency this year. Out of all the Democratic candidates, George McCarthy was too much of an anti-war candidate. He opposed pretty much LBJ's unpopular policies in Vietnam, so he wasn't going to get the nomination. Bobby Kennedy, as you know, was assassinated, like we talked about before, Los Angeles, California, June 1968, by Sirhan Sirhan, so he wasn't going to get it either. But he was replaced by George McGovern of South Dakota. But the only problem with McGovern, who would, get the Democratic nomination in 1972, was that he was passed over as well at the Democratic National Convention that year due to pretty much opposing a lot of the policies of LBJ in Vietnam. Now, you also had the controversial candidacy of George Wallace. That's an interesting topic to talk about as well with the 1968 election. He was a former segregationist from Alabama who proved to be a major thorn in the Democrats' side when he bolted from the Democratic Party after the 1968 DNC. He ran as an independent with the American Independent Party, which, by the way, got on the ballot in 50 states with the presidential election that year. This later split the Democrats in 1968, along with the presidential election vote. But if you know about Wallace, by the way, was the last major third-party candidate to actually win any states. He won 5, mostly southern states, with 46 electoral votes. When Bill Clinton won the presidency in 1992 and 96, you did have like Ross Perot from Texas, who ran as a third-party candidate that won a large percentage of the popular vote, but he failed to win any electoral votes or states. I'm mentioning George Wallace due to the comparison with Robert F. Kennedy Jr., the actual son of Bobby Kennedy, who was assassinated in 1968, RFK Jr., as everybody calls him. He's running for the presidency in 2024. His candidacy could influence the outcome of the, 2024 election, similar to George Wallace, taking away, the popular vote. There's no way that RFK Jr. can win the presidency, but I think his actual candidacy could throw a monkey wrench into the total outcome of the election. He is trying to get on all 50 state ballots. So this could have an effect, into cutting some of the votes for Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. So it could be something that could impact, who wins in 2024. It does seem likely that whoever wins the presidency between Harris and Trump, that it will be one with a minority popular vote that really is probably going to be in the 40-something% range, like 45% or maybe more than that. But it's not going to be a deal where either candidate's going to get over 50%, especially with, these other third-party candidates running like RFK Jr. So it's possible that the Electoral College will probably be a wider margin, but I'm thinking the popular vote for the winner is going to be below 50%. Now, at the Democratic National Convention, which was held in Chicago in August of 1968, the Democrats actually chose Hubert Humphrey as their presidential nominee, along with Edmund Muskie of Maine as his vice presidential nominee. It's believed that LBJ influenced him to pick Edmund Muskie. If you know about the 1968 DNC in Chicago, it was famous for mass protests in a police response against it, which included something like 10,000 demonstrators. They were met by 20,000 or more police and National Guard. And the whole convention was, if you know about it, turned violent. It was clouded in the public mind about whether the policies of Lyndon Johnson or his replacement, Hubert Humphrey, was a good idea. I think some people saw it as an actual failure. And they think that 1968 DNC in Chicago actually helped out the 1968 Republican nominee Richard Nixon get elected. Nixon would successfully campaign against Hubert Humphrey and connect him to the unpopularity of Lyndon Johnson and the general disorder of America. That's one of the things that he would do. I'm guessing that's what Trump's going to do, with Kamala Harris, and say basically it's the same thing as, Joe Biden. And Richard Nixon supposedly made a famous comment about the Democrats and Hubert Humphrey's political position in 1968 with its connection to LBJ's, former failed policies. He said, "Never stop a man when he's trying to commit suicide." Nixon was actually quoting this old Woodrow Wilson quote that went back to the early 20th century about, I guess, a politician that commits political suicide based on his political policies. And the fact that the Democratic unpopular policies at the time, especially on Vietnam, I guess Nixon thought that those would sink the Democrats, in the polls come this November election. So I think this is a similar scenario that the Democrats and Kamala Harris are facing in the current election of 2024. Is Kamala Harris a female Hubert Humphrey? That's the case. Kind of repeating the same thing where they're just replacing the current President Joe Biden, replaced by her from the vice president. And so it's kind of seen as a continuing of the same old policies of her predecessor. Today's major issues are not Vietnam or maybe major social unrest, but I think more along the lines of economic. Like you have, high inflation in America where, like if you want to get a mortgage on a house, it's very high percentage, 6-7%. I think on auto loans, it's about the same, 6-7% as well. I know there's a serious issue with the border, open border. I think illegal immigration is another question that people talk about with this 2024 election as well. Continuing foreign policy issues with China. China's becoming more aggressive with Taiwan. You got still the ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia. You've got the Israel-Gaza war going on with Hamas. And of course, abortion, maybe that might be another issue, but I don't think that's really an issue. I think the big thing that's really a problem is if you look at a lot of the main opinion polls that are out there, it seems to seem one of the main things that I think that to me is a big thing is that it seems like the country's on the wrong track. I think that's the one thing that I've seen with opinion polls more than anything, that it's going in the wrong direction. Besides all that, I think there's two other major issues that the Democrats might face if Kamala Harris is really going to be the candidate, for the 2024 to run against Donald Trump. First of all, is Kamala Harris too liberal or progressive to win, the national election to become president? Can a California liberal progressive win the White House? That's a big concern I think people need to look at. There have only been 3 presidents elected from California: Herbert Hoover, Richard Nixon, and Ronald Reagan. He was originally born in Illinois, but of course, Reagan was governor of California and a great standard bearer for the conservative cause. All were Republicans elected in the 20th century, and of course, none were Democrats. So we never had a Democrat, elected as president from California. The issue of being too liberal or progressive has hurt other candidates before. I think the biggest example of this was Michael Dukakis, the governor of Massachusetts, in the 1988 presidential election. He was deemed too liberal of a Democratic nominee, and if you know about it, he was politically hammered by Republican George H.W. Bush in that election. And Bush went on to win the presidency in a landslide victory in 1988. By the way, the last major recent president to actually do that, to win a landslide victory in the Electoral College and the popular vote. Then secondly, is America ready for the first female president? I think that's the other big issue, too, with the Democrats and Kamala Harris. Harris has already been elected as the first female vice president in American history, which is amazing. But America has had, if you know about it, 46 straight male presidents, no female presidents. And so that's something she's kind of running against in history. If you remember correctly, previously, Hillary Clinton had failed to get elected in 2016 against Donald Trump. Her biggest struggle in the 2016 election was really with male voters, whereby she only received about 42% of the male vote. Women did vote in larger numbers for Clinton. I think about 54% of women voted for Clinton. This will likely be her, Harris's biggest challenge. If she wants to win the presidency in 2024, she's going to have to get a larger number of women to not only vote, but then probably more men on top of that. All these are issues or policies that could sink the Democrats in the November election against Republican Donald Trump. It is also very interesting that the 2024 DNC is being held in Chicago this year, similar to 1968. Will the 2024 DNC turn violent like it did in 1968? You do have the pro-Hamas crowd that continues to protest against the Israel-Gaza war. This could be similar images like in 1968 that could have an effect on the outcome of the 2024 presidential election. I will definitely be getting the popcorn out for that event when that occurs, and it'll be interesting to see how that turns out. So that's the way history is.